Hi, I'm Eason, and welcome back to Metal Monday, where I talk about albums new and old that I recommend you listen to so you can start your week off right. As much as I like listening to involved and intense and sometimes even convoluted albums, there are times when I just want to kick back, relax with something familiar, something a little bit more straightforward, both in its scope and its execution, just to give myself a break. Apropos of this, I decided to cover an album that came out this year that ticks those boxes while still maintaining a level of reputability and notability. The album that I'm talking about is an interesting collaboration between members of three different bands, and I know supergroups always tend to lack that little oomph factor that their original bands tend to have, but hear me out. The album that I'm going to talk about this week is Blasphamagoatachrist's Bastardizing the Purity. I know what you're thinking. What the fuck kind of name is Blasphamagoatachrist? Is it just a bunch of guys trying to be as edgy and intense as possible? Well, no. It's actually a amalgamation of the names of the bands that the members originally belonged to, namely Blasphemy, Goat Penis, and Antichrist. I still know what you're thinking, and no, this is not a straightforward war metal album. If this was the case, I could have just hailed it as a return to form for Blasphemy or the second Antichrist release that we never got to hear coming on finally. That said, however, it's also impossible to say that these guys have strayed all that far away from their usual wheelhouse, because they haven't. The music put forward by Blasphamagoatachrist. You know what, I'm just going to call the band the BGA because this is just going to be easier to say throughout the course of this review. BGA's music is an unholy blend brought together by mixing elements of black metal, thrash metal, groove metal, death metal, and war metal together into one writhing, screaming, furious, pissed off, and quite enjoyable little package. What you're going to hear on Bastardizing the Purity is riffs that often slide more towards one of these genres while still remaining firmly grounded in what I can basically term is a more death metal-like rendition of black thrash, plodding bass that accompanies these riffs and brings a very nice flavor to the proceedings, furious drumming that more often than not delivers blast beats of various speeds and intensity, more on that later, and belched vocals that just sort of belt out the lyrics full-on blasphemy style. I know, I said that this was going to be straightforward, and here I am trying to describe a music that seems to be a mixture of different genres, but hear me out. Even though what I just described may seem complicated or even convoluted, the album is actually far from it, and I think here what makes the difference is the execution. You see, Bastardizing the Purity is completely exempt from all the bells and whistles that you might expect from such a blend. There are no extended keyboard passages or ambient bridges or technical guitar wizardry or ego-masturbating noodling and different guitar techniques or extremely progressive leanings and off-kilter time signatures or any of that shit. This is just straightforward, in-your-face, clenched fist, beat you to a pulp metal. In constructing the riffs that compose the songs that comprise the album, and try saying that 3 times fast, BGA does not resort to experimental articulations of different elements from all these genres to make their riffs. They instead opt to bring you tasteful, incredibly nice, and extremely memorable but very straightforward riffage. This is where the shifting between different genres thing comes into play, because BGA does not go at full tilt 24/7, and their decision not to indulge in that sustained intensity that is inherent to war metal has made all the difference, and it has created a very interesting texture to this album. Bastardizing the Purity's main strength comes from the juxtaposition of its groovier and more intense parts. By incorporating war metal influences to the more intense passages that flood this album and spreading them intermittently throughout throughout the songs, rather than enslaving the songs to it, they have managed to create an interesting contrast that makes the groovier parts seem softer and groovier, and the more intense parts a little bit more intense than they are. In fact, this is exemplified in the first true musical track of this album, Bastardizing the Purity, which opens with this really nice, kind of thrashy, but extremely groovy riff that just sort of plugs along, easing you into the album. They even throw in a pinch harmonics heavy version of the riff as a way of changing things up before deciding to switch gears and go on with the full blast beat, really hard thrash riff, sarcophago type worship. This allows for the groovy intro partition to sink into you and the more intense war metal like stylings that come later to hit harder. Bastardizing the Purity, the track, also manages to separate itself from the rest of the album with its bridge section, which features a cruelly brief part where they throw in rolling militaristic snares into the mix that sounds wonderful. Pity that they never do anything like that ever again on the album, but still, it is nice while it lasts. BGA's tendency to shift between different modes is also reflected in the song structures present throughout this album. You see, the songs on Bastardizing the Purity usually tend to either follow completely circular paths or tend to revolve around certain sections that serve as anchor points. The opening track is one example. Another example is the song Black Nuclear Shadows, which opens up with a really nice sort of mid-tempo death groove that the band slowly amps up until they hit a boiling point, unleash the beast, and go all out on their aggression. They spend most of the song just playing with this highly aggressive partition before tracing their path backwards to the start, first coming in with the secondary, more ramped up partition, and then returning to the mid-tempo death groove that they started with. But perhaps the best example of this type of incremental progress approach to song structuring comes with the track Death Alchemy, which is basically one big experiment in constructing a song from variations on a single riff. What they do on Death Alchemy is actually very interesting, mainly because the song keeps constantly folding in on itself and going in circles, and somehow manages to not be boring. You see, BGA introduce a main riff, and then they evolve it slightly to a secondary state, the new form, if you will, which serves as the anchor point of this track. From there on out, no matter where they go or what direction they take the track in, it always circles back to that secondary state, which provides grounding for the entire track. This is actually one of the greatest strengths of Bastardizing the Purity, in that instead of throwing 1,000 riffs at you or just outlining how many riffs they have managed to cram into an album as if that is a measure of success, they needlework the few riffs that they have in and they work them deep. They do everything within their power to make sure that the riffs that they provide you get buried and buried deep in your head. This approach to structuring songs also allows BGA to easily execute the transitions incorporated into these songs, and this is definitely a plus since these transitions are usually between genres. It isn't uncommon for you to hear more than one genre incorporated into a nicely structured track on Bastardizing the Purity. For instance, the track Abysmal Commands moves between black metal, death metal, and thrash metal. Similarly, Genocide Evocation seems to draw more from groove metal and death metal than anything else, and Fire Demons of Blockula, as perhaps per the name, seems to exist solely so that people will start debating whether it's called bestial black metal or war metal. The only exception to both the structural inclinations of this album and these genre transitions would be the track The Final Blood Orgy, which is basically more or less your more straightforward and a little bit more standard war metal track. This song is just balls to the wall, hard and fast stuff that doesn't really let on and seems to exempt itself from the rule of not constantly going at full tilt that I have mentioned earlier, which adds a little bit of variety to the album and makes for one intense experience. Here I have to mention the fact that the drumming manages to keep up with all these transitions quite adequately, even though most of the time what you are going to get, especially when you think about the genre's concern, is blast beats of various speeds and various intensities. The final track, Evil Revelation, is perhaps the one that exemplifies this trait of the album the best, since the bulk of this song consists of blast beats of various speeds being thrown in your face. This is not to say that the drumming on Bastardizing the Purity is stale. It is far from it. There are quite a few very nice, very fast tom attacks, and overall the execution is as forceful and straightforward as it should be. The only major weakness of this album is due to the fact that BGA has chosen to keep things very tightly constrained to an extremely narrow framework, no matter how many genres that they are pulling from. As a result of this, especially during the second half, the album starts to slide gradually into a bit of a formula. The back end of this album is filled with tracks that start out with these groovier, softer parts that almost immediately devolve into the highly aggressive war metal-like stylings and tracing the circular paths that I have mentioned earlier in this video, thereby ending up slightly more formulaic than I would have liked. But I mean, thinking about it, it does seem a little bit par for the course, especially considering the fact that these genres are really closely related and there's only so much you can do without actually going into full-on progressive territories, and in the name of keeping things straightforward, I think this is still good enough. Of course, this wouldn't be a video that I have made unless I bitch about the production a little bit, but luckily for you, I'm not going to so much bitch about it as I am going to praise it, and in an unexpected way too. The production on this album is suitably, and I never fucking thought that I would say this, muddy. It is suitably muddy. It has a really warm, sort of almost vinyl-like quality to it. It isn't so much like you're sitting here listening to an album. It is more like you are in the studio with the band and they have real nice equipment and a very adept sound engineer who has managed to mix it exceptionally well. One point of praise that I'm absolutely going to give the band, and props you guys, in avoiding the type of chronic underproduction that seems to plague war metal albums across the landscape. Like, you can still be intense with good enough production, and Bastardizing the Purity is proof of that. So with all that said, does Blasphamagoatachrist bring anything new or revolutionary to the table? I don't think that is the right question, because I think the right question is, do they really fucking need to? I've said it before, and I know I'm going to say it again. There is room for bands who do things that we have heard before, but do it with real passion, like real fire in their hearts. And this album is one of those types of albums. I would recommend this album to black metal fans, death metal fans, war metal fans, thrash metal fans, groove metal fans, and or anyone who like their music aggressive, a little bit more straightforward, and without all those interesting little tricks thrown in. As always, there's a Bandcamp link in the description down below. Why don't you go click that, listen to it, and then come back and tell me what you thought about it. If you're already a fan of the bands I have mentioned, you probably already listened to this, so why don't you come here and tell me what's up? If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe, as it always helps. And as always, it's Eason. Peace out. Shit, did I have Lamsey covered up throughout this video?